What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video we're going to be talking about Lisa Frankenstein. Directed by Zelda Williams and written by Diablo Cody, this film stars people like Cathryn Newton, Cole Sprouse, Liza Soberano, Carla, Gugino, and many, many more. So it's been a little bit over a week since I did my last movie review here on the channel, and I'm itching to talk about another movie. If you guys saw my latest video for MegaCon that I did here on the channel, you know that last weekend I had my hands full with that, and I also mentioned that I've been dealing with vertigo, which has put me behind a little bit on my movie watching. I'm starting to feel a little bit better, but I'm not fully there just yet. But I wanted to go and check out the newest release of this week, and that is Lisa Frankenstein, which going into it, I had no idea it was going to be directed by Zelda Williams, who is the daughter of course, the late great Robin Williams. And they've directed various forms of different like short films as well as some music videos, if I am not mistaken. And so this is actually the first thing of theirs that I've ever seen that they've directed. And going into it and seeing that name at the beginning, I was pretty intrigued. I didn't know that going into the movie. Instantly just saw that as soon as the movie opened, and I was instantly intrigued by it. And this film is actually written by Diablo Cody, who's written films like Jennifer's Body, which going into this, I didn't know if this was going to be in that kind of vein, if it was going to be something similar to that. And they've of course written plenty of other things, but I was very curious to see whether I was going to enjoy this film or not. Lisa Frankenstein was not a movie that was highly anticipated for me, nor was it a movie that I was even really sure I was going to enjoy, but I enjoy the people that are behind making this film, at least that I knew that were part of it, as well as people like Cathryn Newton in the lead role, as well as Cole Sprouse, who I most notably know as Cody from the Zack and Cody that I grew up watching when I was a kid. I haven't really seen him do much in his adult years in acting, though I know he's been in a lot of things, most notably I think Rivendell, I think is one of the name, Riverdale, out of one of those shows that's on the CW, I believe. I've never actually watched that show. I know that he's got a lot of praise in some of the different things he's acted in as he's gotten older, but I've never seen him in anything. So going into this, I was also curious to see how I was going to feel about Cole Sprouse as an actor, as an adult, versus having watched him on the Disney Channel when I was also a kid. And so let's talk about what Lisa Frankenstein's all about, because going into it, one thing I knew for sure, it was that this was going to be a horror comedy romance. And if you guys have been following this channel for any amount of time, then you know that I'm a huge fan of horror comedy. It's one of my favorite subgenres of the horror genre as a whole. I just feel like it's so much fun a lot of times, and you can take the horror aesthetic, a Halloween aesthetic in a lot of ways, and just make something that's more fun to watch than it is spooky and creepy. And so going into this movie, it had my interest just because I knew it was a horror comedy. This movie opens up and we're introduced to the character of Lisa, who's played by Cathryn Newton, and right out of the gate we learn that she has a troubled past. Her mother was killed right in front of her pretty much, and this led to her becoming somebody who's dealing with a lot of, you know, antisocial situations in their life. They don't really have a lot going on mentally. They kind of are walking around as a zombie, and this movie as a comedy definitely leans into her kind of being this over-the-top zombie-like individual at first. The people are afraid to hang around. People think she's weird. People are kind of creeped out by her. She's the one that people talk about. People start to assume whether or not maybe she killed her mother. And so right out of the gate, we get to know her character is somebody who's, you know, a bit of an oddity in the mix with everybody else, but clearly shows us with this movie that's bright and vibrant that all the people around her are just as disconnected from reality as she is. Well, not too long into the film, we learn that she kind of has this fascination with this nearby graveyard that's been abandoned, and specifically with this one headstone that actually has an actual bust of one of the individuals who died there, who of course is Cole Sprouse. And when she accidentally wishes this individual back to life, she is surprised to see Cole Sprouse as a zombie coming through her window at home, and now you have this weird kind of offbeat romance that's built throughout the course of this horror comedy, where the more that they get to know each other, the closer that they get, even though he can't communicate because he is a zombie and doesn't have the ability to speak when they first meet. She slowly helps him come to life, and in a lot of ways, he helps her come back to life. But it's one of these weird things where as he's starting to come back to life more throughout the course of the film, as she helps him scavenge different body parts that are needed to make him more whole, while she is starting to flourish a lot more, she is also losing a part of who she is in kind of this newfound energy that is kind of coming from this relationship. I don't want to say too much without getting into spoilers, but that's the basic gist. You have this weird offbeat horror comedy romance between a woman and a zombie, or a teenager and a zombie, and it's just very Tim Burton in a lot of ways. If you've been following this channel, then you know that I love Tim Burton, and while I haven't covered an abundance of the films of his that I still want to talk about here on the channel, the ones that I have covered, I've always just been a fan of his weird, offbeat feel and vibe. There was a lot about this film that actually reminded me a lot of the film Edward Scissorhand, of course, which is one of the most popular films that has ever come from Tim Burton, starring Johnny Depp. And so there was a lot of elements of this film that reminded me of that, aesthetically and even in its tone. And so right out of the gate, I was really intrigued by a lot of the filmmaking tactics. This film is very colorful and vibrant. It takes us to the 1980s, so you have a lot of that 1980s attire, as well as a great soundtrack with some of my favorite 80s songs making appearances in this. I think the first song that appears in this movie, I think, is The Promise by When in Rome, which is one of my favorite songs from the 80s. And so right out of the gate, the music got me into it, the aesthetic, the costume design, the lighting, the cinematography, and the fact that the entire cast knew what kind of movie they were clearly in. And that's one of my favorite things when it comes to a horror comedy, is the ability to be transported into a world that is a little bit over the top. There's this hyper reality to it. There's this element of it that's just a bit, offbeat. And Tim Burton's one of those directors that does that so well. And I think that Zelda Williams did a good job here mixing the aesthetic of the film with the performances to give us this offbeat reality that you can kind of, start to buy into as time goes on. And I think that outside of Zelda Williams' direction, it's the main cast, most notably Cathryn Newton and Cole Sprouse, that really allow you to sink yourself into this world and understand the kind of weird, whimsical place that you need to be in mentally to watch a movie like this. As a fan of those kind of movies, as a fan of weird, offbeat kind of movies that have an oddity to them, yeah, I went into this movie really intrigued by all those filmmaking elements and the performances that pulled me into that world. And if I had to say there was one big standout for me in this movie, it was actually Cole Sprouse, who doesn't have an abundance of dialogue, if at all, in this film, and most of it is all kind of just physical acting, a lot of body humor, as well as a lot of miming that he had to do throughout the course of the film to get through these various sequences. And I think Cole Sprouse did a really great job at leaning into the humor of this film. And Cathryn Newton is a great lead in this film as well. She definitely knew the role. She knew what this movie was all about. She knew what it needed to feel like, and I think she committed to it 110%. Now, with all that said, like any horror comedy, any movie in general, and most notably like any comedy in general, this is a movie that I think is going to work for some and not work for others. It's incredibly divided as it currently is between the critics and the audiences on things like Rotten Tomatoes, not to even mention various other sites like Letterboxd and other movie review sites. And I can genuinely say, after having talked about it all the way up to this point, after having praised a lot about this film, that I was kind of torn by this film by the time I got to the end of it. While I appreciated everything I've mentioned thus far, I struggled with the dialogue, the overall narrative, the almost lack of character arcs that are present in this film, as well as the humor and just a lot of small moments between the characters. Again, I was really impressed by the cast. I was impressed by the world that we're introduced to, the colors, the lighting, the cinematography of the film, the overall idea, and the kind of weird, whimsical, kind of Tim Burton nature of this film while it was playing out. And while there were moments that I thought were great that started to make me think, okay, I'm more positive on this movie now, I'm more positive on this movie now, there was unfortunately so many other scenes throughout the course of the film and just the overall picture and the way it ends that ultimately just kind of left me shrugging my shoulders when the movie was over. Now, I saw this movie with my fiance and I looked over at her and I kind of had a bit of a kind of look to myself, and she goes, I liked it. I wasn't mad at it. And I've seen some of my other friends on Letterboxd say that they enjoyed the film as well. So I think that this is one of those situations where it's really going to depend on your personal taste. As a big fan of film, as a big fan of filmmaking, there were so many fantastic things that were done and utilized to make this film. And I do think there's going to be a fandom for this film. I think there's going to definitely be a percentage of the audience who watches this movie that really enjoys it. I saw it in a pretty packed theater, and there were plenty of laughs throughout the course of the film, but that oftentimes led to me feeling like, man, I'm just having a disconnect with this movie because I really didn't find it to be all that funny at all. Again, I'm a huge fan of horror comedy. I can appreciate how stupid and silly a lot of times horror comedies have to be. Hell, there's probably movies that I've talked about here on this channel that are horror comedies that some of you don't like that I've praised way more than I can this movie. But ultimately, by the time I got to the nearing end of this film, I just felt like I never really fully attached to the characters and the story. While there were a couple of moments that made me laugh, while there were a couple of moments that I found myself more intrigued by the story and the characters, by the time we got to the end, I ultimately found a lot of the story to kind of feel like it meandered. I also felt like a lot of the humor and the dialogue kind of felt flat for me, and by the time the movie came to an end, I just didn't really feel like there was much of a satisfying story or character arc for either one of our characters. If there was a character that I felt got the most satisfying character arc throughout the course of the film, it was probably Cole Sprouse as the zombie character. But outside of that, while I do appreciate and enjoy what they did with Cathryn Newton's lead character in the film, I just ultimately found myself just feeling nothing but a shrug of the shoulders by the time the credits were rolling at the very end of this movie. I wish I enjoyed the film more. I really do. I think this is a movie that could have been right up my alley. And when I saw some of my peers giving it really negative reviews, I go, man, you know what? While I don't necessarily expect to love this film or think of it as a possible top 10 contender by the time we get to 2024's end, I was watching it or going into it based on the trailers and a lot of the marketing and the posters thinking it looks like a good, silly, over-the-top, ridiculous horror comedy romance that I can get on board for. And unfortunately, while I was on board for a lot of it when it comes to the filmmaking side of things, narratively and character-wise, the things that I care for the most in any movie, I ultimately found myself just to be a little bit bored and ultimately didn't really find it to be all that funny or compelling. So with all that said, that's my thoughts on Lisa Frankenstein, and I want to hear what all of you guys have to say. Are you on board with a lot of the audience that actually is really enjoying this film and finds it to be a good, funny time? Or are you agreeing with myself and maybe some other critics who have found the film to be a bit middle of the road? I'm definitely curious to hear all the various opinions on this movie. I think it's really going to depend on your personal taste. I think that that's usually the case with any movie, but I think horror comedy, as far as horror goes, is probably the one genre within horror that is the most divisive. Comedy itself is easily one of the most divisive things of all time. So you add in horror comedy, you add in romance, you add in, just a comedy in general that's trying to, at times, not even lean too much into horror, but be more of a comedy. And you have a movie that is very unique, has its own identity, and is very strange, but ultimately I don't think it's going to connect with everybody. I think it's really going to depend on your personal taste of humor, and I wish that I laughed as much as some of the people in my theater did today. I just couldn't. So a big thanks to you guys for watching. Hit that like button, comment for more videos, subscribe for more videos. That's what I meant to say. Comment your thoughts. I'm doing fantastic here, aren't I, folks? Hit that like button, comment your thoughts down below. Hit that subscribe button for more videos, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.